Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll give it a few more minutes for some more folks to come on in. But thank you for joining the first session of our Community Safety Through Racial Justice Learning Series. Up on the screen, you'll see just a few reminders as folks arrive that if you're on your phone audio and also on your computer, if you could link those two with your participant ID. And then if you're not speaking, we'll ask that you mute your microphone since this is a meeting and not a webinar. You'll have the freedom to unmute if needed, if you have some questions later in the session. And then we encourage you to have your camera on if you're comfortable. No pressure, but we do like being able to see everyone who's joining us today. And then lastly, definitely make use of the chat box. We'll keep an eye on it. If you have any questions or comments, we'll do our best to address those. But like I said, we'll get started in just a couple more minutes as a few more folks join us.
Looks like we have folks from lots of different places. Hi, Vanessa, Louie, Mason, Janet, folks from Chicago, Oregon, Syracuse, Sandy Hook. Wow. Lots of folks from different places. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are.
Definitely. So I think we can go ahead and get started. We're a few minutes in and some more folks will join us along the way. But I'll go ahead and pass it over to Xavier to get us started.
Awesome. Yes, thanks everyone from coming from all over the country. Haven't seen anything international yet, but wouldn't be surprised if we did. Thank you again for signing up and joining on to this first session for the Community Safety Through Racial Justice Learning Series. Today, the folks at PI here you'll see are myself, Laquana Williams, and Zach Tarro. I and Laquana and myself will be primarily facilitating, and Zach will be the man behind the curtain running it all and making sure this all runs smoothly. So thank you, Zach. Thank you, Laquana. Let's, I guess, go ahead and get started then. So as you see here, our smiling faces. Lisa actually is on a well-deserved vacation, but before I let everyone else introduce themselves, I just wanted to really quickly tell you a little bit about myself. So I joined PI as a program coordinator back in January, which seems like a long time ago, but I guess time is all relative, and especially within this pandemic, it's really flown by. Before I came to PI, I was working for the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, and before that, Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. So I joined the safety and well-being team with an emphasis on racial justice, community safety, greening and environmental equity, as well as youth leadership. And now I'll go ahead and kick it to Laquana so she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Laquana Williams. I'm a program manager with Prevention Institute, and I am heading into my 4th year at PI. I work across a number of projects, including our training and technical assistance, which is why I'm doing a presentation like this today. I head up a lot of our health equity and racial justice work. And I've been doing this work for some time now, about 13 years. My previous work before I came to PI was in a local health department, and I've also done some work in education as well. So I'm excited to be here with you all today, and thank you so much for joining us. I think I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Tarro. I work with Prevention Institute out of the Oakland office. I'm a senior research assistant. I've been here about 1.5 years, and I also recently just finished my master's in public health from San Francisco State University. So still relatively new to the public health field and work, but definitely excited to be here and in community with all of you today.
Thanks, Zach and Laquana. Yeah, so if you want to learn a little bit more about the PI team and anyone outside of these 4 folks you see on the screen, we will be downloading and sharing a PDF version of these slides after this presentation. And you can check us out at the link you see on the screen. And as always, because we know money makes the world go round. We have to give a shout out of appreciation for the folks at Langlois Foundation for allowing us to put this on. And we are really excited for what we have for you today. So on to what we're going to talk about. Since this is the first of three in the learning series, we are going to think of this session specifically as an introduction to these three things you see here. We're going to talk about some concepts and frameworks to help understand and operationalize racial justice in your violence prevention programs. We're going to introduce how to identify some choice points in programs, practices, and policies, and therefore we're going to hope to build greater capacity through this continuous improvement within your organizations and within your communities. And finally, we're going to introduce some ways to build capacity to normalize, prioritize, and incentivize truth, racial healing, and transformation in violence prevention work. Now, before we get into things, we really have a loaded session for you. We will be talking quite a bit, but there will be plenty of opportunities to get involved through polls, chat questions, and if you just have something that you want to raise, please feel free to put it in the chat, or if there's time, we'll possibly be able to have some folks come on and ask a question or be able to bring themselves into the space. But in order to do that, I thought it would be a good idea, and usually these sessions and facilitations that I've hosted, you have a set of community agreements, and I'm going to go ahead and offer these four for us to learn within. We want to respect the wealth of experiences that folks bring into this room, recognizing that we're all coming to this along different journeys. We are all at different points in our space of learning, and we are all here for one common goal. Therefore, we have to recognize that folks are coming from their different paths and bring different experiences and might be able to come offer some insight that you might not be aware of, no matter where you are on your journey. And to build on this, we want folks to voice their thoughts and share the space. Please feel comfortable, or we hope that you feel comfortable bringing yourself represented either through the chat or, again, as we get later into this series, we hope that folks will have the opportunity and take the opportunity to come on screen and speak to some of the ideas that we're talking about and the concepts in the discussion. And because I really think that this is not going to be a problem here, but it's always good to say, we want to make sure that if we disagree with somebody or something that someone says, that's what it is. It's not necessarily disagreeing with the person themselves. We're going to challenge the idea that they brought forth with the hope that we will be able to learn from one another. You can go on to the next slide. We're going to, now that we've told you a little bit about us and what we want to do here today, let's go ahead and learn a little bit something about you. So Zach's going to go ahead and give us about 45 seconds or so just for this quick poll as to how many Prevention Institute webinars or learning sessions you've been a part of. So really quickly, let's just go ahead and see where everyone's coming from. All right, Zach, I think that's most of the folks have answered, and that's about 45 seconds. So tell us what folks are saying. How many of PI sessions have people been involved in?
Looks like about half the folks here, this is their first time. So definitely thank you for joining and welcome. And we have a few who are somewhere in the middle. And then there looks like about 6 folks who have done more than 10. So there are participation superstars for the day. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I love that. Some real superstars here that love our content. And I'm really excited to see that half the folks are joining us for the first time because that's just another touch point that we have with folks and another way to be connected. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and ask you another one. A little bit more about yourselves just to get everybody in the spirit of sharing. We did ask you this before, but we'll give folks another 35 to 40 seconds just to tell us what field they're coming from, what sector they work in. All right, Zach, what field are folks coming to us from today?
Looks like a lot joining us are from community-based organizations, nonprofits, as well as some state and local government, but we also have a few across every sector that we've included. So Thank you for joining us today, no matter what sector you're coming from, and we hope that the learnings and discussion today will be really relevant for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, and thank you for indulging me in that poll as well. And if we can go to the next slide. Even though we already asked you what sector you work in when you signed up, as you'll see this very busy slide, I'm going to pause here to say, don't worry. We've already shared this with you in the Community Safety Realized paper prior to this session, and we will be sharing again after this session, along with some other materials that we are going to learn and talk about today. So, again, the reason we asked you what sector you work in is because if you'll make your way all the way to the bottom of this, you'll see in that third bottom section, sample sectors and partners who are going to be in this work as we talk about two pathways. One pathway to safety and healing, and one to injury and death. Now, that's a little gruesome, but this is the world that we work in, and it's an everyday reality for those of us who practice this work, as well as those we serve. So I'm going to bring us again back up to the top, because that's the way that we read. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about these two pathways. And this actually comes to us, as I mentioned, from the Community Safety Realized paper that we worked on, PI, with Big Cities Health Coalition. And we actually did give a quick webinar about 5 to 6 weeks ago about this specifically. So I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but I do want to go through it because it will be important, as this is one of the frameworks that we talked about for just helping look at your work through this scope. So starting with the pathway to injury and death, that all starts with social and racial inequity. That produces these inequitable systems and institutions that we know create community risk factors. And within those community risk factors, there are individual and relational risk factors that lead to injury, trauma, and death. Now, if you'll notice, there's a green pathway towards safety and healing that cuts at every point along that pathway to trauma and death. And that's because these are instances in which we can, as whatever sector we're coming from, we can influence the communities that we serve and push them and bring them closer towards that pathway to safety and healing. And that pathway begins, obviously, with social and racial equity, leading to the creation of just systems and institutions that create community protective factors for individual and relational protective factors, and that leads us to that safety and healing. Now, this light blue line that cuts across just underneath those two pathways are the core elements of this framework. And just to name a few, we have moral conviction and political courage, which is not always easy to come by with government commitment, residential leadership, and multi-sector collaboration, just to name a few of those. Now, in the middle section, we'll see the sample strategies for the practitioners like ourselves along this spectrum to really try and move our communities towards this pathway to safety and healing. Things like tax reform, crazy things like paying people living wages, equitable community investment, fair lending, housing, youth employment, fellowships for peace, culturally rooted practices, and restorative justice, just to name a few. And if you'll move all the way back down to the bottom, there's a darker blue, navy-ish, we'll say, line that is labeled upfront, in the thick, and in the aftermath. Now, this is something that we liken in the public health world to primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. So we also wanted to use these three phrases, upfront, in the thick, and in the aftermath. So we weren't necessarily coming to communities or folks that wanted to learn about this through this kind of hierarchical public health language, because it's really important to meet people where they are and not just talk about things just for the sake of having conversations like at a high level. We want to have impact and really, like I said, affect change and move folks and communities towards that pathway of healing and safety. So I think I have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to tell a quick parable that I do not know the exact origin of, and I'm sure there's many different iterations, but I'm going to tell this, this parable of three sisters that I've found most useful for really describing how on this continuum of upfront to in the aftermath of where violence prevention practitioners find themselves. So starting off, there were three sisters walking along a stream. All of a sudden, they see a child drowning in the stream. First sister jumps right into action. She jumps into the water and starts saving these children that are falling in. But there's so many children that have fallen in. The second sister looks a little bit upstream, goes further upstream to start teaching kids how to swim once they've fallen in. But the third sister, she goes even further upstream, and she decides to figure out why is it that these children are falling in the stream in the first place? And as an example, why is it children of color that are falling in at a disproportionate rate compared to other children? Now, the whole point of this story is, to me, what I learned, that there's different places along this continuum that people can use their strength to move our communities and move our children towards this pathway towards healing and safety. Now, the last time I told this story, it was with a group at Drexel, and there was one young man who asked me, or really kind of just told me flat out, if everyone's going upstream, if everyone's going to that upfront primary prevention, what about all the children who have already fallen in? And number one, that was brilliant from someone who's at least 10 years younger than me. And he, really just proved the point that everyone has a role, no matter what sector you come from. There is a place for you to have your imprint, and there is a place for you to work with those folks along the other places of the continuum to really affect change for a positive, safe, and community of healing. So I just spoke a lot, so I'm going to pause as we switch to the next slide, but definitely welcome any questions that might come up. As a facilitation strategy, I've also learned just to let dead air kind of just be, because that usually gets folks to come into the conversation. But hearing crickets, I will just keep on moving. So one of the ways and another framework to think about operationalizing racial justice is through past disadvantage, contemporary participation, and future consequence. These three dimensions of time that we're thinking about racial justice and how to make it a standard practice, not just a one-off. So when we think about past disadvantage, we have to acknowledge that certain communities, particularly communities of color, have been not given economic opportunities and really not been given the opportunity to practice their best health. So with that in mind, we really have to think about what can we do knowing there is this past disadvantage, bringing in things like contemporary participation. The reason that, or one reason that there's been such disadvantage is because the folks who are having decisions made for them aren't involved a lot in these and how these decisions are made at all. So knowing that, we should be thinking, how can we encourage and engage folks who have been most affected by inequities? How can we get them into this process and really have their views and their insights represented moving forward? And then on a long-term basis, we really need to think about how we can prevent inequities from growing and prevent them from being born in the first place. And that comes from organizational capacity to really understand and to really talk about this, as well as having data that will be able to prove this is real, this is a fact, and we can't act like it's not happening. We also can't act like it's happening out of nowhere. There's a reason that these inequities existed, and using things like contemporary participation and some other outlets, we can build a community and build communities that will have sustained resources for equitable outcomes. And I forgot to mention so far, this comes to us from USC's program for equity and regional equity, environmental and regional equity. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. This is not something that we created on our own, but always got to remember that. On to the next slide. So this is a biggie in just the picture. So this framework is the last one that I want to introduce, is the 3 equity objectives. So when we're talking about equity, there's a few different ways to think about it. And I'm going to apologize in advance if I mispronounce this name, but it comes to us from UN, the Guide to Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness Planning. And you might be thinking, well, we're talking about violence prevention and community safety. Why is climate preparedness coming into the conversation? And really that just kind of illustrates that this framework and this way of thinking has multiple applications, from community safety and violence prevention to voter participation to climate preparedness. So I'm just going to give you a couple definitions, talk about what it might look like, and I might even tap on Laquana to go and add a couple extra examples that I might not have on hand. So when we're talking about procedural equity, this means fair, transparent, and inclusive processes, and we're talking about also creating additional opportunities for folks who have been previously disadvantaged. So again, we already talked about the history of community safety and opportunities and economic advantages in this country especially, but we really have to go and make sure that processes are fair, and the folks who have been previously excluded are now intentionally included in conversations that will affect them, their health and safety, and the health and safety of their families. Now, what this could look like is just acknowledging that there's imbalances in power dynamics as well as in technical expertise. So the folks that live in communities that are suffering from greater rates of violence and harm, they know exactly what their problems are. Not problems, I don't want to say, but they know exactly why things are happening in their community that shouldn't be. And they have more insight than folks who have the technical expertise like we do to actually implement programs that we want in their community specifically. So we want to acknowledge that folks in communities that we serve are the experts of their own experience and of their communities especially. We want to focus on raising authentic voice. We want to focus on giving agency to the folks, as I said, who know what's going on and know why things are happening in their communities, and not just us who come in for a program or come in to talk about a specific community day event. So if we want to move on to distributional equity, that is something that I think most of us are more familiar with and really are able to get a grasp of, because it's something tangible. We're talking about resources and distribution of not only the benefits, but of the burdens. And we definitely, when we're trying to advance equity and we're trying to move our communities towards that pathway of safety and healing, we really want to make sure that we're emphasizing and prioritizing these resources for communities that have been previously disinvested in and really discounted and discredited for all of the advantages and the resources and all of that good that they have to give. Now, what this could look like is we're talking about having a responsibility to make sure that the communities we're working with have everything that they need, and also asking them, what is it that you need, or what is it that you need based on what you see is going on in your community that we can help you to advance equity, justice, and move towards safety and healing. Now, the biggest one out of all these three is structural equity. This really gets at what we were talking about on the last slide, and it's talking about those underlying factors such as systemic and structural racism that put communities down intentionally and sometimes unintentionally without really recognizing that. So we really have to appreciate that even though we may have the best intentions in mind, we may not be putting out what we're imagining is going on in our minds in our work plans, and in our strategies. So what this looks like is to intentionally create new norms and policies and ways of representation so that we don't work within our offices, our organizations, have what we think is a great idea, and then bring it to a community that it's not going to work for, and we're going to have wasted resources, time, and effort when we could have had the answer starting with those communities and using their knowledge and accessing all of the information that they have to work and make our jobs easier. So right now, I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to pause again, and I'm going to kick it over to Laquana if she has anything to add to these specific sections that I mentioned.
Hi, everybody. No, Xavier, I think that was great, and hopefully you all got a good understanding of the three equity objectives as they're laid out here. I did want to briefly respond to a question that came into the chat from Lee. He asked about related to the parable that you shared, Xavier, what groups or organizations we might be partnering with or relying on to address things like racism and white supremacy more broadly in our country. And that's a really great question. We have been taking a really intentional look at who we are partnering with and how, deciding, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation too, deciding kind of when to step up and when to step back. So when to lead and when to make sure that community-based organizations that are staffed by leads who come from communities of color, or communities that we are, wanting to represent specifically, have the ability to actually, lead the cause. Also, if you're familiar with PI at all, you know that a lot of our work focuses on upstream prevention, which usually drives policy efforts. So while most of our work doesn't particularly focus on grassroots organizations doing this work, we are looking at what the policy ramifications are for everything that's happening related to equity and racial justice. So I just wanted to add that. And I think it ties in very well to the three equity objectives that Xavier has just laid out there too. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And Xavier, do you want to go ahead and launch the poll and describe what it is?
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and we'll give you 60 whole seconds this time to respond to which of the three equity objectives most aligns with your work. And again, I will read the definition because it's not in front of you. We've got procedural equity, which is transparent, fair, and inclusive processes with additional opportunities for those who have been disproportionately impacted. Distributional equity, we have fair distribution of resources, benefits, and burdens, prioritizing resources for communities experiencing the greatest inequities. And then finally, we have structural equity, which addresses the underlying structural factors and policies that has given rise to these inequities, and therefore making a commitment to correct past harms and preventing future unintended consequences. And feel free at this point also to share in the chat if you have either an example or maybe just want to speak to one of these objectives as it relates to your work. Definitely more than happy to have that as well. All right, so I gave folks a little bit more time on that. You had 90 seconds, so Zach, let's go ahead and close that off and see what folks are saying.
It's like a fairly even split with a little bit more for distributional than the other two, but like I said, pretty evenly split, and that's really exciting to see the kind of range of work that folks are engaging in, and hopefully that these forms of equity really speak to you wherever you fit into this puzzle.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And again, I think the distributional equity is something that most of us are very familiar with, just because we all have deadlines and objectives we need to meet, and you need to be able to quantify that. So distributional equity really kind of goes hand in hand with that. We're talking about how can we quantify this equity effort that we're making. So thank you again for going ahead and just really thanks again for just being a part of this process. I really love that everyone is getting really involved in the chat. I saw a couple messages that I'd love to respond to. So as I try and do that, I'm going to pass it back to Laquana.
Thank you, Xavier. Yeah, I'm seeing a message coming in from D'Angelo about the definitions in the chat. So if you could share those, that would be great. Christopher says that they believe structural equity is aspirational and work in progress for communities of color committed to root causes and communities most impacted being at the center. Interesting. I was actually going to say that I was pretty surprised to see that most people pick distributional equity. I think I understand why, but I was assuming that most would likely pick structural equity, only because that's been a huge topic of discussion in the public health realm for quite some time as we're looking to address some of the root causes. So I think what I'm maybe understanding from your comment, Christopher, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it may feel a little aspirational because there are so many day-to-day things that folks in impacted communities are working to address. So that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Joshua said they had a tough time deciding which to fall into. They're sending trained professionals to 911 calls for mental health, homelessness, substance use, and more. Good, all good work. Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note here is that these categories all overlap and that you don't have to work on one before you work on another. You can be working on multiple ones throughout your time. So don't feel like you have to fit into one category. Aristia says that distributional equity is their most visible equity work. I hear you on that. And we're weaving other forms into our work more quietly to help build muscles and partners who might not consider themselves at the forefront of equity work. Yes, so partnering with different organizations. I mean, I think that's one of the beautiful things about public health. We definitely recognize when to and how to center ourselves in the work and when to step back a little bit too. And so those of you working with organizations that may be a little bit different from your own, I think you understand exactly why this is so important. All right, so thank you all for sharing. There's a lot coming in the chat. And so we will continue doing our best to keep up with that, but feel free to continue adding comments or questions in the chat as well. Okay, so I am going to move us towards operationalizing racial justice. So a lot of what we've talked about so far has been really setting the stage or providing frameworks that help you conceptually think about what this work looks like. And I know that some people are in that space where they're still working on that themselves, and they're also assisting their partners in including better language around how to talk about these issues as well. And then some of us may be in a place where we're looking to move forward, right? Like what do we do? What can we be doing now? What does this look like in practice? So hopefully we can give you all some tools today to think about this moving forward. So next slide. Okay. So some of you all may be familiar with an organization called Race Forward. Last year at the top of 2020, we partnered with Rinku Sen, who used to be part of Race Forward as an organization, but was doing some subcontracting work with us to really take a look at our communications work, right? So those of you who are on our listserv, who get the emails from us, participate in this event, or look at this e-blog, or this is what's happening currently in the news. We wanted her to really take a look at that and tell us where we might need to do better in communicating a message around racial justice, to advance racial justice. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty scary position to be in, right? To put that question out there and to say, what do we need to do differently? And I believe for the most part, what she shared with us was that, well, one was a framework around the choices that we have in our work around communication and how that applies to advancing our work utilizing a racial justice lens. So one of the examples that she shared around our violence prevention work was that we often talk about, at that time, we were often talking about our violence prevention work and the impacts of that on communities of color. And in some of our other work, maybe our park equity work, or some of our more TTAC work, or even some of our frameworks around system of prevention, et cetera, we were not necessarily lifting up the agencies of communities of color at the same rate, or talking about them at the same rate that we were doing in our violence prevention work. And in some ways, doing that could kind of inadvertently, add to the stereotypical images or ideas or thoughts that people have about who is involved in violence in the first place, right? And this goes back to what Xavier was talking about unintentional consequences. Sometimes they are intentional consequences, not on our part, but in general, with the way that we know our systems operate, and them being really embedded in upholding white supremacy, we often know that the choices that we make around advancing racial justice, there's just some minor tweaks that could help us either go down a pathway of equity for everyone, or one that continues to perpetuate the status quo. So she shared with us a methodology around choice points and utilizing a racial justice lens. So what is a choice point? A choice point is a decision-making opportunity that influences your outcomes. It is the cumulative impact of many small choices that can be as significant as the impact of some of our big decisions. So the important thing to know here is that you don't have to wait until you have this huge grand deliverable to meet. You can be thinking about racial justice along every step of your process so that those cumulative impacts add up over time, right? We know that those negative cumulative impacts on violence and on health disparities add up over time. We also believe that the positive ones can add up and make a significant difference in the lives of people in our communities. When we're conscious of the choice points and the related impacts, we are less likely to replicate the status quo, and we become open to new possibilities for equitable change. And I think this is so important because oftentimes we're operating in the sense of doing things in the way that we've always done them. Maybe you are part of an organization who's always done things this way. Nobody's explained why to you. However, if you're not questioning those steps along the way, and this is a scary thing, don't get me wrong, you run the risk of just replicating the status quo and getting the same results. So sometimes you have to think a little bit differently about what's going to lead you to your desired outcome of advancing racial justice. So what do some of those questions look like? Zach, can you take us to the next slide? Some of the things you might be asking yourself as you look to operationalize racial justice in your violence prevention work are, what are some of the decision-making points that are going to affect my outcomes in the first place? What decisions and actions am I using that may be reinforcing bias and some of the current inequities in communities that we see? And then here's the tricky part. What alternative action options could produce some different outcomes, right? So you're looking at what the outcomes, you already have an idea of what you want your outcomes to be at the start of this process. And remember, this is a cycle almost of continuous improvement for those of you who are familiar with, QI or quality improvement metrics. This is a process that you repeat repeatedly, right? It's cyclical. You may be asking yourself which action will help to best advance racial justice, and what reminders, supports, and accountability systems can be structured into some of your routine practices to keep racial justice as a high priority. Now, the key here in all of this is the racial justice piece, and that requires a lens that needs to be sharpened over time. And if we think about our learning and our experiences, racial justice or advancing racial justice, because it's not something that we can ever achieve per se. But if we think about it as a continuum of learning, there's going to be some starts and stops. There's going to be some slow paced movement and some very fast paced movement. But if you keep racial justice in the center, you always have the ability to keep your eye on the goal. And I think this is important because it's a really intentional focus on centering racial justice, particularly in your violence prevention work, in a way that maybe we haven't always done before. Next slide. Okay, so now you have your objective, your overall goal, and what it is you want to achieve. So you may be asking yourself, what are some of the steps that I need to take in order to make this work in thinking about my choice points? And we want to give you all an opportunity to practice some choice points. And we have another methodology called like a weightlifting metaphor of whether your choice points are like lifting 3-pound weights or whether they're like lifting 20-pound weights, depending on where you and your organization are in this process. So we're going to send you all home with some homework between now and the next session. But these choice points, the first step is obviously to identify what that choice point is. What is the choice point in your work? Where do you have some influence on a decision or a course of action that may affect the racial and absolutely gender justice outcomes of tomorrow, right? What do you think are some of the, what can you leverage in your work should be the question that you're asking yourself. And then after you've identified that, you want to generate some options. So from that choice point, you should identify some alternative actions that can lead to more just outcomes. So maybe you say, okay, in our programs around, I'll give you an example, distributing COVID-19 vaccines, we know that certain communities are not necessarily, having equal access to some of that. Or we know that certain communities are experiencing disproportionately high rates of violence in those areas. So what might we do differently would be the question that you'd be asking yourself. And what opportunities or influence can you be leveraging in order to make some of those different decisions? So after you've done those two things, you would then select a new course of action. So you would decide which option could leverage the most racially just change. And back to the kind of weight metaphor, you would choose, maybe you start off with a smaller pound weight. You would choose a 3-pound weight or action that you are confident you and your team have the capacity to lift. And then you might work your way up to a 10-pound weight. And maybe your 20-pound weight might be specifically related to policy change efforts, or might be related to funding stream mechanisms and how to get those directly into communities of color. So identify what the low-hanging fruit is and how you want to continue to move forward in your actions. And then finally, you want to identify some supports and accountabilities. So again, this is part of the QI process. So you'd be asking yourself, what reminders, supports, and accountability practices can be structured into the routines that you already have? Maybe you need to be thinking about new routines that are more inclusive, so that's an option. What kind of things can you structure into your routines to keep racial justice a high priority? Who can you depend on to tap on you to say, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about the impacts of this program or this funding stream on communities of color who may be suffering the most? So I'm going to pause right there and, like Xavier, just stop and take a second to see if there are any questions or comments coming up from any of you all. And I'm going to open it up. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if that works for you, or type it into the chat. Okay. I don't think I'm seeing anything right now, but if something comes up, please feel free to virtually tap me on the shoulder. All right, next slide, Zach. So the important thing here is to recognize that we have a responsibility to normalize conversations and engagement around racial justice. I know that everybody is coming to this from different starting points. Some of you all may be in communities where you're not even able to use this language just yet. Some of you may be in communities where you've been utilizing this language for a very long time, and folks have almost become desensitized to it. I know that some of you all are from communities where racism has recently been declared a public health issue. So I want you all to be thinking about, what does that look like in practice? Maybe even utilizing the procedural distributional structural equity framework to think about what that looks like in communities and how that best serves community-based organizations and those working directly with the folks on the ground. So normalizing conversations around racial justice is super important. Building a shared understanding of the terms and concepts helps us all to be on the same page about what we're talking about and why. Naming racism is exceptionally important, right? There's no reason, well, there are reasons, but the best way to address racism is to actually call it out for what it is. And it's not just about normalizing those conversations either. It's also about prioritizing some of the mechanisms that advance a more racially just approach to violence prevention as well. And then finally, outside of prioritizing it, we also want to incentivize it and incentivize urgency towards change. And I think that sometimes, you know, we feel like this work might simply be heart work, good heart work, right? It makes us feel good to be doing something that's so important. And I think we also recognize that so many people's lives are on the lines as well. And so this urgency and incentivizing the work is super important. And of course, incentives also means funding streams for being willing to do the work as well. It's important not to shy away from difficult conversations around race. We have to sit with that discomfort and move through it. It's part of the process, and move towards truth and healing. And I would even add some reconciliation in there as well. It looks like we have something happening in the chat. Deja says, I want folks to say white supremacy is a public health crisis. Absolutely. Absolutely, Deja. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. It is. That's what if we're talking about working at the root of the issue, that's where we should be working. The recognition of that and the acknowledgement of that is something that I'm not totally sure we are there yet or ready for just yet. D'Angelo says that California has not declared racism a public health crisis. I don't know if we have as a state. I do know that many local jurisdictions have definitely done that. And again, the question that we should be asking them is, so now what, right? This is great. This is recognition that there's an issue happening. And now what are our plans to do about this? What are we putting into practice? Okay, awesome. All right, next slide, Zach. Thank you. Okay, so I'm posing a chat question here. And I want to see if this methodology around choice points is working or is making sense for you all, particularly since we're going to be sending out a worksheet for you all to think about this in connection with the equity framework that we shared. So the question is, and feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just add to the conversation verbally or type into the chat, how might you be considering using the choice point methodology to operationalize a racial justice approach to your work? Does it make sense to you? Are you still needing some more time to sit with it? I imagine you definitely are. I am still sitting with it after months of working with it. But it has allowed me to think differently about the language I use, about where I can leverage opportunities, and you know, being conscious all the time of applying a racial justice approach. So what is coming up for you all? I'm imagining folks are typing. I hope folks are typing. And it looks like Jacqueline has raised a hand. Jacqueline, please feel free if you want to unmute yourself to do so and ask a question or add a comment.
Like, let me be the first one to speak. I think the first thing that really stands out to me is like housing. Housing is what starts everything from where you live, the parks that you access, the schooling. If you are in a desert, a food desert, a transportation desert, a medical desert, it's like so many things. It's like where you live is it gives you a just your pre-factors of like where your health is going to be. It also ranks how long you're going to live if you live in that area. I live in Los Angeles, next to freeways. I have asthma, and it's like it makes sense where I live. And I think something that adds to racial equity, as living in a neighborhood that was considered a neighborhood of color and now it's gentrified, it's like even that trauma of gentrification and feeling like, am I gonna live here if things are gonna, like my doctor, all these things. So it's just like there's multiple traumas that at least as an Angelino who is feeling like housing is so expensive. And I think there's like a study of like how housing is in the US. It's just not feasible. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but racial justice and the work that I do is just having an empathetic approach to like all the other factors that the community members I work with are facing, and just really being as empathetic and understanding as I can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being brave enough to enter into the space and sharing. I think you are right on par with, you know, talking about the importance of housing, right? Particularly in Los Angeles, but of course all across the country. I'm also in LA in our Leimert Park office. So I hear you as a native Angelino as well. And the issue of gentrification, you know, I think this is where the choice points piece becomes so important, right? Because if we think about who our intended community members are that we want to have in those communities, we might be thinking about who will remain and who will be coming in and what that does to change the dynamics of that community. So I live in Inglewood. You know, we got the big SoFi Stadium. I can literally see it from my window here. Beautiful. So many small businesses have closed down because of that. And, you know, well, not just because of that, but lots of different issues associated with that. So just that one, you know, idea or thought about, you know, we want to build this new beautiful thing. Who do we want to remain here? How can we think specifically about the communities that want to continue to be part of this process? I think we're going to take one more question, and we're going to try to respond to some of you all in the chat by writing to you. So Christopher has a hand raised. Go for it, Christopher.
Thank you, Laquana. I'm Christopher with Together for Brothers on Tiwa land here in Albuquerque. So we participated with PI with Making Connections, and that was this really thoughtful 5-year process of engaging young people. And one of the things I want to bring up, and I appreciate, right, the person before me bringing up housing, but I think about how intersectional all the issues are, right? We've been working with PI on some park equity issues, for example, and now we're trying to bring in how to work with young people of color, young men of color in particular, most impacted around policing and community violence, and thinking about alternatives to policing and alternatives to incarceration. But it's so connected to outdoor recreation and park equity. It's so connected to, like the previous person said, housing, but it's also connected to food security. It's also connected to where you appreciate, we're doing some work with PI right now also about healthy relationships and thinking about sexual assault connected to racial justice. And so it really makes me think about a couple things. All these issues are intersected, but also how are we making space so that young people and all of our communities have access to some of the language. We have a couple of young people on today. And so just if there's partners at PI or maybe partners in the community that want to also like be in formation of how do young people make sure that they're at the table and that they're being able to make space by being able to have the language accessible and space to even dialogue and reflect on what they're hearing and feeling about all of this. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you for inviting the young people to be part of this conversation. I just want to say briefly that we are going to be working, these sessions as peer learning forums, and so we know we did a lot of content today, but going forward, we really want to hear from you all. So if you have ideas, programs, partnerships that you want to talk about, that you want to advance, definitely reach out to us so that we can partner with you to be part of these learning sessions more formally. And so, yes, thank you, Christopher, for talking about the interconnections of this work too. I'm so happy that you aren't thinking about this in silos. I know it's hard, in operationalizing it to not necessarily do the work in small buckets or in silos, but the fact that you are thinking about how this connects to so many different public health issues, I think says a ton about who you are and the work that you are doing. So thank you to all of you for being, so interactive and part of this process. You can definitely reach out to us with any additional comments or questions. I'm going to turn it over to Zach to close us out for today since we're at time.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for joining us. Some information is up on the screen right now. We'll hope you'll be able to join us for the second session, which will be in September on the 21st at the same time. And then keep an eye out for a follow-up email. We'll include that registration link again. If you registered for this first one, the way that we set it up is that you'll be registered for all three. So you should be able to just use the same Zoom link. But if you want to pass it along to any other partners or folks that haven't signed up yet, we'll be sure to include that link to our page so that you can sign up. And then we'll include the slides from today and some additional resources about the frameworks, as well as the follow-up worksheet that Laquana mentioned. And if you have any questions, our email addresses are also below.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you next time, and hopefully with some more friends that you're going to tell how great of a time you had in this session. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.